So here on our farm in northern Vermont, we raise ducks and geese. And one of the questions that people frequently have for me is,
where do you get your ducks and geese from?
And since it's the time of year that people are starting to plan out their springs and summers on their farms and homesteads, I figured I would make a short video to just explain where my ducks and geese come from. So since we're in the dead of winter right now, we are at sort of our low point for the number of birds that we have. Once it gets to be summer, we'll probably have 5 or 6 times the amount of birds on our farm than we do right now. We raise our birds for both meat and eggs. And when it gets to be the winter time, we tend to cull down so that we don't have as high feed costs and we're ready for the next generation next year. From my point of view, there's 5 different ways that you can have ducks and geese show up at your farm. Number 1 is you can buy them at the store. Number 2 is that you can buy them from a hatchery and have them shipped to you. Number 3 is that you can take eggs and hatch them yourself. Number 4 is you can have mother birds hatch the eggs for you. And then number 5 is you can just get them from somebody who's looking to get rid of their birds. Now let me take you through the strengths and weaknesses of each of those approaches. Now probably my least favorite approach for getting birds on the farm is buying them from a store. Like if you go to like one of those big box rural supply stores, you don't know the stress that those birds have been through. You don't know how long they've been in transit. And so I strongly advise people against buying birds at the store on a whim. And I know we all see those birds in the store and fall in love with them and we want to get them. But generally speaking, from a quality perspective, I find that they're pretty horrible. The only type of store setting that I would actually buy them from is directly from a farm. And by the way, this is very self-serving of me. Sometimes in the spring and summer months, we will sell baby ducklings to folks who are in the area. You have to actually come to our farm and pick them up, and they're usually a couple of days old. But I find that it overcomes all those ethical hurdles that come with those big box store purchases. And so one option you could have is to find a local duck or goose farm in your area and ask them if they're going to have any hatchlings for sale, because that's a really easy way to get them, and you can just have them right there and you know where they come from and you even know what their parents are like. Guess what, guys? I just got a phone call from the post office here in Peacham. The ducklings are arrived. I'm going to pick them up right now. The second way that you can get birds up on your farm is to buy them online or through a catalog from one of the major hatcheries. The advantages of buying them online like this is that, number one, your choice of breed and variety and options and even numbers are significantly better than probably any other method. You can literally go online and just flip through and look at all the pictures and read all the breed characteristics and fantasize about the types of birds you want, and then just toss them in your shopping cart and check out, and they will show up in the not too distant future. So most of our khaki Campbell ducks that we have on our farm, as well as all of the geese that we have on our farm right now, all came from mail order hatcheries. And I know for some of you who are watching this video, the premise must seem just completely crazy, right? You're taking these little baby birds, tossing them into a box, entrusting them to the U.S. Postal Service, and then a day or two later, they just show up at your local post office.
The guy that delivers the mail says they'd like to be some too. He was singing, they quiet everything. I said, okay, I'll let them know.
Well, thank you very much.
You are so very welcome.
I know how insane that is. But when it comes down to it, for most varieties of ducks, geese, and chickens, when they're babies, they actually don't need to eat or drink water for the first couple of days. And so I have never lost a bird in transit, and I have never lost a bird in those first early days. That's not to say that that can't happen, but I haven't had issues with it yet so far. But that's why it's really important to work with a good, reputable hatchery. Because I've got plenty of friends who have these horror stories of absolutely horrible situations where the hatchery just put pretty much already dead birds in a box and sent them to them.
Hello, Polly! Wakey!
And I will say that shipping and transit process is the drawback to this approach. Because when it comes down to it, you're putting a lot up to chance. Something could get screwed up. A postal worker could forget to call you and they could just die in the back of your mailroom. Somebody at a warehouse or a packing facility could expose the birds to an extreme amount of cold, and you could wind up with a lot of dead birds. And so there are risks that exist within that process. And I will also say the anxiety of like getting these tracking alerts and watching your package go from one part of the country to you is kind of anxiety inducing. And that time that the birds are in transit, I found has always been a very stressful time for me. The third option is you can hatch them yourself. A little over a month ago, I ended up donating a bunch of the fertilized duck eggs to the local preschool. And they went through this experiment of actually incubating and hatching their own ducklings. And so these guys are the product of that hatching. So while it's very difficult to ship live baby birds through the mail, shipping eggs is actually really, really easy. I've done it many times and have had some great success. Oftentimes in the spring, summer, and fall, we will sell our fertilized hatching eggs to people and we'll package them up in a box and ship them off, and they'll take them and they'll hatch them. So it always kind of amuses me to think that like the grandchildren of the quacking are out there scattered across the country. Keep a lookout, because here on Goldshaw Farm, we will be selling more hatching eggs in 2020. We're just not quite ready yet. Egg production isn't up to full speed. Mating cycle is kind of out of cycle right now. And on top of it all, it's so darn cold. A lot of the eggs are in a state that actually isn't hatchable, and sort of the fertility gets ruined really quickly because the temperatures are so low. But I will say that this year, most of the ducks that we have on our farm will be hatched by us. It's pretty simple to get an incubator and set it aside, and for 28 days for a duck, I believe it's 30 days for a goose, you just let them sit in there, you make sure you maintain the proper temperature and the proper humidity, and boom, you get several of your eggs are gonna hatch. It's kind of a miraculous thing to see, and frankly, it's probably one of my favorite ways to get birds on the farm. But I will admit that it takes a little bit more work than the other methods, because you have to really be pre-planning and you have to be sort of nurturing and playing the mother duck or goose for those eggs and watching over them carefully. But that said, I find it pretty straightforward, and I find it kind of fun to watch the miracle of birth, where you're personally taking that one little egg and watching it turn into a little bird. There's our little friend. I see one. All right, Mom, so I'm gonna need you to get up. I'm gonna need you to get up for a sec. Whoa, okay, easy, Mom. Whoa. All right. The fourth method of getting birds on your farm is to have the mothers hatch them out. So if you already have ducks or geese on your farm, or even if you have chickens, you can just simply slip fertilized eggs under a broody bird, or that broody bird is just gonna sit on her own fertilized eggs. And as long as you're a little bit patient, and as long as you have some good mothers, you can have some baby birds. I think the absolute best part about having the mothers hatch them out is you don't have to do nearly as much work to raise them. You know, if you're buying them at the store or buying them from a hatchery or hatching them yourself, you're gonna have to be responsible for brooding those birds. That means you're gonna have to keep them in a warm enclosure, you're gonna have heat lamps, you're gonna have to really nurture them for the first month and a half of their life, or else they're gonna catch cold and they could die pretty easily. Baby waterfowl are very fragile in those first 6 weeks, and so you gotta just really invest the time and energy in them. But if you have the mother hatching them out, you know, you can actually just let the mother do her thing and let nature take its course. So that is absolutely the upside to having a mother hatch. And on top of it all, you don't have to have a mother just hatch her own eggs, right? You can have chickens hatching ducks, you can have geese hatching ducks, you can have chickens hatching geese, maybe. I don't know. The egg sometimes is a little bit too big. But just the same, I mean, there's really some good opportunities for mixing and matching birds. So don't feel like you're just constrained to the offspring of your current birds. You can get fertilized eggs and just hatch out additional birds under a broody mother. Now, the downside to this approach is that some breeds of birds are terrible mothers. So here on our farm, for example, we have khaki Campbell ducks. Khaki Campbell ducks are amazing egg layers. They're great foragers, but the downside is they are terrible mothers. Last summer, I actually tried an experiment where I had several of my khaki Campbell mothers sit on clutches of eggs and try to get them to hatch out. They ended up wasting about 60 eggs. I only had 3 birds actually hatch, And 2 of those birds were killed off in the first few weeks just because of weather and poor maternal instincts. But there is one duck in our flock who she was hatched naturally here on the farm and raised by the rest of the flock. And she's doing great. You can actually see her right there. In 2020, I have no plans to hatch ducks naturally, but I do intend to try to see if I can get some of my geese to lay on some of their eggs and hatch those. We'll see how it goes. And again, this hatching naturally thing is somewhat of a crapshoot, and so you got to be a little bit careful there. So if you have like a farm business plan that's banking on your ducks or geese hatching off their offspring, be careful because it can be a risky proposition. So yesterday afternoon, a friend of ours here in town stopped by. And he said, hey, listen, I've got these 2 ducks. I don't really want them anymore. Do you want to take them? And I said, sure. And so we decided to rehome 2 Pekin ducks. They're a male and a female. And then the 5th and final way that you can get birds on your farm, well, you can actually have somebody just give you a bird, or you can buy it off of Craigslist. You know, the disadvantages to this approach is that you don't necessarily know how they were raised. They could carry some sort of illness. But if you can check for those issues, or it's a source that you trust. For example, a couple of years ago, some friends gave us 2 of our Pekin ducks, and they have just been an excellent addition to the flock. They're great birds for meat production. They've provided us with a couple of offspring, and they're just a lot of fun to watch. They weren't birds that I'd buy, but I'm really glad we have them. So never hesitate to check around to see if there's birds available and you can just adopt a bird. And by the way, I hear from a lot of folks who live in like a housing association regulated area or in a more urban setting, and they're concerned about getting ducks because of the noise. Well, remember, really the quacking pretty much only comes from the female ducks, and the male ducks are relatively quiet. So if you're looking for a way to just add a couple of birds to your home, one option could be to try to adopt some drakes, the male ducks. The drakes are quiet. They only really make this like raspy noise. You could get like 2 or 3 drakes, and while you wouldn't get eggs, you would have ducks. And you can have them in your garden, and you can have them hanging out, and you can have them as comic relief. You got to be careful with your ratios if you have females and males together with ducks. But you can easily have just a crew of bachelor drakes hanging out on your place, and they wouldn't cause any problems, and they get along pretty well. So yeah, that's where I get my ducks and geese. Thanks, guys.